Good afternoon and welcome to our noon forum presented by the Associated Student Speakers Program. This afternoon we are very pleased to welcome to our campus author Erskine Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell began his writing career in the news media, and he served as a foreign correspondent to Mexico, Spain, Czechoslovakia, China, and the Soviet Union. He is best known for his novels Tobacco Road and his study of the Southern poor whites in God's Little Acre, which has been published in 26 countries and in 24 languages. His most recent books include Around About America, his views upon touring our own country, and another book, new book on the South, In Search of Bisco. And now it is my pleasure to welcome to UCLA Mr. Erskine Caldwell.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been told that time is of the essence here, so we can't waste too much of that. But I will say that perhaps you want to know why I'm here. I'm here because I was invited. You might want to know where I came from. I came from the East Coast. And how did I get here? I got here in an airplane, just as most people do these days who take a trip across the country in somewhat of a hurry. Well, this was just a usual, ordinary trip. When the airplane got up into the air of about 35 or 40,000 feet, the airline stewardess took off her uniform and put on a Playboy Club bunny costume to serve the cocktails. And then when it was time for dinner, the captain left that mysterious front part of the airplane and came back and charcoaled the steaks. Just an ordinary trip. But I think I found out on this particular trip what sometimes might happen up there in that mysterious front part of the plane where the captain, the co-pilot, the engineer, and the radio operator have their office. Because I heard one stewardess whisper to another stewardess, and this is what she said. She said, "Watch yourself when you go up front. The captain has turned on the automatic pilot." Well, you know, we're here to talk about writing, and in this world of reading and writing, there are many instances when the written word is much more important to the person who reads it than to the person who writes it. A recent instance about this shows how important it can be to the reader. A college student whose grades had fallen below the water level, so to speak, was inducted into the armed forces, much against his principles. Well, it happened that his principles were exemplified by campus picketing, protest marching, and similar forms of current student negation. Well, at the training camp where this young man was sent for basic training, the sergeant noticed that he spent all of his free time walking around the campgrounds looking for scraps of paper wherever he could find one. And when he picked up one, he'd look at it, read it eagerly, then throw it aside and say, "That's not it." Well, the sergeant was baffled by this young man's behavior. He was so baffled that he sent him to the Army psychiatrist to find out why he behaved as he did, what was wrong with him. Well, the Army psychiatrist spent several hours questioning this young man, and after that length of time, he was still unable to get any satisfactory answer as to why he spent all of his free time looking for pieces of paper, reading them eagerly, and then throwing them aside and saying, "That's not it." So the Army psychiatrist wrote out an official Army discharge and handed it to him. Well, he looked at it, he read it eagerly, and he smiled, and he said, "That's it." Well, you know, talking about going into the Army these days, not long ago, one of these young men was hustled through basic training, and almost before he knew it, he found himself in Vietnam, South Vietnam. And it so happened that he'd only been there for 2 or 3 days when he found himself in a hospital. Well, I haven't cleared this with the political committee of the university, but I suppose it's all right to go ahead. But anyway, President Johnson, sort of a coincidence, President Johnson had asked Vice President Hubert Humphrey to go over to South Vietnam to see how the war was going and see what the men needed and so forth, and to cheer them up the morale. So Hubert was in this army hospital in South Vietnam. He saw this young man he had one arm in a cast that was on a pulley on a rope pulled up to the ceiling, and one of his legs was in another cast, and that was stretched way out there. So Hubert said, "Son, how did you get hurt in this war?" Well, the young man said, "I'll tell you exactly how it happened, sir." He said, when I came over here, I couldn't tell one Vietnamese from another. I didn't know what a Viet Cong looked like or a friendly Vietnamese, because everybody looked alike. So the sergeant told me how to tell the difference between the friends and the enemies. And I did just exactly what the sergeant told me to do. He put me out on patrol, and I was walking up this road, and I saw this Vietnamese coming toward me. So, just like the sergeant said, I shouted out to him as loudly as I could, "To hell with Ho Chi Minh." Well, when I did that, this Vietnamese shouted right back at me, "To hell with LBJ." So we were standing there shaking hands. And while we were shaking hands, a GI truck came along and ran over both of us. Well, you know, in this, the starting point of a writer of fiction is usually as vague and lost in the past as a person's first remembered moment of consciousness as a child. All we can say is that somehow it happened to us because one day we found ourselves trying to write a story. No matter what happened, it's likely to remain a lifelong mystery as to why it happened to us. But during all those years of perhaps struggle and strife and assorted economic hardships and perhaps marital hardships too, but anyway, many of us would eagerly have gone back in time and place and put up a pitiful plea for a chance to select a more humane and more compassionate occupation in life. But this urge, or this perverse dictate of fate, which says such and such a person is to become a writer, whether he wants to be a writer or not, this urge is as restless in its demand as the stomach is for daily food. And there may not be such a person as a natural-born writer, but if that's the way it's going to be, nobody can run away and prevent writing from being thrust upon him. And if writing is to be done, the person who expects the ability to write to come to him without effort will certainly bemoan his fate if his writing is not immediately successful and financially profitable. But naturally, it is neither of these two things in the beginning, because words put together, one after the other, have no purpose, have no meaning, unless the cumulative effect conveys more than ordinary thought, action, and implication. And if the final result, after months or years of effort, does not produce a story, all is purposeless, worthless, and a waste of everybody's time and patience. This means there is no excuse to try to write fiction unless the person has a compulsion to write and the talent to accomplish it. A restless housewife with nothing better to do is not necessarily a compulsive writer, and a retired traveling salesman is not necessarily a talented writer merely because he can recall some of the lurid details of his youthful years on the road. However, a lot of people are curious about what is thought to be the secret of writing, and they yearn for the time when this magic secret will be revealed so that they too may become writers. But there is no secret. magic, esoteric, or practical. The ability to become a writer is merely the result of combining compulsion, talent in ideal proportions, under favorable conditions, such as the right phase of the moon, and with fingers firmly crossed. From then on is to be as luck will have it. And even though there is no secret to be revealed, and even if luck is a writer's best friend, the world is full of people without compulsion and without talent who somehow acquire and doggedly cultivate the ambition to be writers. Now, this can be a harmless pastime and as good a hobby as finger painting or stamp collecting, as long as the person is content with the pride of an amateur. However, if he becomes desperate for professional achievement, public acclaim, there is a danger of his resorting to the imitation of an accomplished writer or attending so-called creative writing courses in a college or university. The only excuse for the first of these, imitation, is when the result becomes good satire or burlesque, and the only excuse for the second, creative writing courses, is when it is realized that fiction writing is a dramatic account of possible human experiences that are infused with tragic, comic, or romantic implications. Consequently, experience and imagination are among the prime sources of fiction, and so-called creation is merely the practical use of them. That may be the trouble, however. Talking about these things, we become involved in generalities, semantics, suppositions. If we kept on, I would not. It's a good argument for debate. But if we kept on like this, I would not have a chance to tell you about one person who early in life felt that he had the compulsion to be a writer, and then spent a long time trying to find out if he had the talent to be one. Being more familiar with my own case history than I am with that of anyone else, it would seem to be an excuse enough to talk about me for a moment. And so, speaking personally, I do know, while never lacking in compulsion, I am still not too sure about the talent. But I can attest to the fact that luck, and I mean the lucky kind of luck, has never been a handicap to any writer. Well, when I was in my high school teens many years ago, I was living in a restless summer in the state of Georgia. And I had just like a person has a craving for a candy bar, or a cow will have a craving for a lick of salt, I had a craving for a typewriter. Well, perhaps it could be said that typewriter was merely symbolic of a desire to be a writer, but I prefer to think I was being very practical about it. Well, a wise and knowing person, of course, would have completed his college education in those days, including a course in creative writing. But I was too impatient to wait any longer. But I was not a college dropout. I was an in-and-out student for many years. Well, I found that there's always plenty to write about in a small community where you know the name of every dog in town, and there's plenty to write about in a large city where your next-door neighbor may sue you for invasion of privacy if you even say good morning to him. The trouble is you have to learn by trial and error how to tell a story in a printed word, and a typewriter itself is not going to show you how it is done. Well, after quite a few years of newspaper reporting and odd jobs of all kinds, I succeeded in getting the first story of mine published in a magazine. And the fact that the magazine made no payment for this story was no cause for unhappiness, because after all those years, it was satisfaction enough just to see the story in print. Perhaps because when you're young and dedicated, money can wait. But anyway, there may have been shorter cuts to the way I took, but if there were, I have no regrets for the way I went, because it was along the way I went that I found that experience, the experience of living, whether pleasant or unpleasant, contribute to the basic material of fiction. Well, after a long period of apprenticeship, I find that I continue to seek experience wherever I can find it, by going and being and living and searching for it any part of the world, because personal experiences themselves are never thrilling and exciting. They only become that when someone writes them into an autobiography. But the doings of other people are never dull, and what they do makes a story to be told. Before it is assumed that the act of acquiring a typewriter is a guarantee of a successful career as a writer, it should be taken into account that there are a lot of ifs and buts about it. This is something I learned early in life in off-campus courses of sociology and in non-scholastic courses of economics. After I had owned my first typewriter for almost a year, I began wandering through the southern states with it, carrying it in a small suitcase for several months. Then finally, I found myself in Baltimore, and it was there that a trusting landlady rented me a room for $5 a week, no payment in advance. Well, but a week later, the landlady's husband came home unexpectedly, and he was quick to discover that I was a non-paying guest, and he lost no time in telling me that if I did not pay 2 weeks' rent in advance by noon the next day, he was going to confiscate both my typewriter and my suitcase and lock me out of my room. Well, he told me some other things too, but that's another story. So there was only one thing to do. I took the typewriter to a pawn shop and pawned it for $10. Now I had a place to sleep and I had my suitcase, but I had no typewriter. After a long night of anguish, being parted from my typewriter for the first time, I went back to the pawn shop the next morning and pleaded with the pawnbroker, please to let me use my typewriter in the back room of his shop to write a story. Well, he agreed, provided that I would spend the same amount of time cleaning and polishing his stocks of guns and pistols as I spent typing. I have no recollection of the particular story I was trying to write in the back room of this pawn shop in Baltimore, but I do know that the pawnbroker was as kind-hearted as the landlady had been before her husband came home. After almost 2 weeks, I cleaned every firearm, I had polished every clock, and I had restrung every banjo in the pawn shop. And that was when the pawnbroker read my story and shook his head and said he had no way of knowing if it had any literary value or not, but that as a handyman, I had earned back my typewriter and $5 in cash in addition. And so, I've had a good feeling about Baltimore ever since. Well, once a person is committed to a typewriter, and wherever he may go in the world, these ifs and buts continue to be an important part of his life. This was as certain to me in the 1940s in China as it had been to me for the past 15 years in America. Well, by that time, portable typewriters were being made, complete with a carrying case, and but they still weighed as much as 25 pounds. Well, I had a modern, up-to-date 25-pound portable typewriter when I arrived in Hong Kong in the early spring of 1941 on the back doorway to Moscow. Naturally, as anyone would do, I bargained with a Chinese tailor in Hong Kong to make me a suit of clothes overnight. The suiting cloth was authentic British woolen, and the color I selected was a shade somewhere between canary yellow and hamburger mustard. It was a real bargain, only $25 American in those days. But of course the bargain price may have had something to do with the tailor's overstock of cloth in that particular color. Well, this took place during the time of the Japanese-Chinese War. And civilian airline planes operated only during the hours of darkness. After several nights, however, I had made my way across Mother China and was somewhere in Mongolia. Well, this was where wartime regulations caught up with everybody. Aviation gasoline was scarce, and there was only one single-engine, six-passenger airplane a week across the Gobi Desert from Mongolia to Turkestan. And the most important of these wartime regulations was that no passenger could carry baggage weighing more than 30 pounds. Well, so there I was at a Chinese military airfield somewhere in Mongolia with 25 pounds of typewriter and two large suitcases having a combined weight of 40 pounds. Well, there was no argument about the matter in any language, Mongolian, Chinese, Russian, or English. 35 pounds had to be dumped, as I was told, or I could stay there for the duration. So naturally I chose to dump. I kept the typewriter, 5 pounds of shirts and socks, and of course wore the colorful new Hong Kong tailored suit. Everything else was distributed to local Mongolians on a first-come, first-served basis. And this could have been the origin of the American giveaway program abroad. Well, when I arrived in Moscow in the spring of that year, 1941, to stay for a number of months as a radio and newspaper correspondent, I was not particularly embarrassed by my appearance in the beginning. In fact, I considered that I was receiving admiring glances from the Russians who envied me my Hong Kong tailored suit made of fine British woolen. However, and then when a Russian looked at me a second time, I was convinced that he was thinking how drab his own dark clothing looked in contrast to my canary yellow hamburger mustard suit and pants. But after a while, though, late in the summer of that year, 1941, I began to feel somewhat self-conscious about my appearance, especially when I was invited to dark suit receptions at the American Embassy. I was soon being the last to arrive and the first to leave. But fortunately, the wife of the American ambassador took pity on me, and she suggested that I might feel more at ease if I had my cocktail served to me alone in the second-floor parlor of the embassy and had my dinner served to me on a tray in the men's smoking room. Well, this was a most satisfactory face-saving arrangement for me, as evidently it was also for the members of the Japanese diplomatic corps and military staff. They always went to the second-floor parlor to drink sake alone, and then to the men's smoking room to have that dinner served to them on trays rather than mingle socially with the British and Americans. Well, I was spoken to only once by Japanese at an embassy reception during that summer and autumn just prior to Pearl Harbor, 1941. A full-bodied Japanese general in a military uniform of great splendor took me aside and carefully felt the texture of my coat lapels. After that, he asked in confidence if I were a spy on leave from Hong Kong. I told him no, that I was a writer who traveled with a typewriter in preference to carrying many extra suits of clothes around the world. But I told him that the next time I went to Hong Kong, I was going to have a suit made in a more conservative color. Well, the Japanese general bowed and shook my hand for the first and only time. I am convinced that he was convinced that I was a spy and would have offered me a job as counter-spy for the Japanese if I had not been wearing such a peculiar-looking suit of clothes. And so no doubt I lost an interesting job because I had chosen to leave these extra suits in Mongolia so I could take my typewriter to Moscow. And so more than that, I probably lost the opportunity to become a counter-spy in the service of my own country. And it was all because of my typewriter addiction. Well, we talked on this subject of typewriter symbolism, typewriter addiction, the side effects of having only one suit of clothes. Perhaps for a few moments we ought to consider what is called literature in certain high-toned intellectual circles. But in my book there is no such thing as literature. Instead, there's good writing and there's bad writing. Nothing else before, between, or after. You keep the good, you throw out the bad. It's as simple as that. And it is so easy to distinguish between the good and the bad that it is a mystery why so many people are unable to see the difference between these two extremes. And as a result, they are the ones who will either rely upon a prejudiced critic to make a dubious distinction for them, or they will subscribe to a book club and receive pre-digested baby food in a pretty pink package. If a person has a desire to read a book, and there's no reason to read a book unless you wish to, but if a person has this desire, he is certainly capable of relying upon his own judgment in selecting what will be of interest and or benefit to him. But if a person reads only pre-selected books, his reading is done at the dictation of somebody else, and he never has the opportunity to learn by personal experience how to tell the difference between the good and the bad. Well, it is this kind of blind acceptance that encourages intolerance, because the less a person knows, the less willing he is to learn. Whereas the more a person learns, the more tolerant he becomes. As a sometime reader myself, I would not presume to tell anybody to read such and such a book merely because it was of interest to me. And I doubt very much if I would read a book merely because it was said to be of interest to somebody else. Because reading is a personal matter and the prerogative of the individual. It is not a matter of public conformity. At least that's the way it is in a democracy when freedom prevails. But this freedom to read and to write in this particular decade of our century is often a shocking and deplorable situation to many people of the earlier generations. But times change, and customs change, just as styles of clothing do. And while we were not looking, perhaps, an inevitable evolution of ideals, customs, and morals was taking place. Well, of course, recent and contemporary generations of college students should be given credit for many of these progressive changes in American life. But campus uprisings are not always intellectually inspired. Organizing protest rallies, picketing the dean, boycotting the Coke machines, not exactly intellectual, but no matter what the aim, these campus uprisings are legitimate protests against outmoded policies of the establishment, wherever it exists, Berkeley, Bennington, or Philadelphia. Of course, some student demands are not always politic, but they are always evidence of a healthy educational climate. And then students do have an escape hatch in reserve when the dean tells them that if they do not like the way the college is being run, they can always pack up and leave, and then join the Marine Corps and try to revolutionize that. But one of the things that students nowadays do not have to protest too much about is censorship. It was not so long ago, 10 or 12 years ago, when books were being banned in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and elsewhere as fast as the censors could turn the pages and read. There was hardly a reputable author in those days who somewhere in America was not being charged or taken to court for writing what was said to be obscene or pornographic fiction. I should know something about this, because in those days I was frequently before the courts in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and elsewhere, trying to defend my usage of the English language for the purpose of storytelling. As a result, I was on the docket so frequently and in so many places that I had to work double time in order to write the next book to be taken to court. But consider what happens nowadays. The censors evidently have gone out of business, probably to write the kind of books they are most familiar with. And no longer is there anybody to solicit a bribe to take a book to court and spell out four-letter words. And so the young writer of today, who has never been banned and who has no hope of being charged with obscenity and pornography in the contemporary climate, this young writer will no doubt become frustrated. And when that happens, what will he do? He will have to resort to writing novels of a strictly moral nature in words of many syllables. Well, it may be a good thing. So any day now, perhaps we should expect to see a completion of a full cycle in American writing and a return to novels that are interesting and exciting because of the emotional and intellectual power of the author's talent. It may be too much to expect, but it is possible that these younger writers would not only be spelling out 8, 10, and 12-letter words, but perhaps also basing their fiction on the framework of rousing storytelling. And if this should happen, there will be, I'm sure, a lot of happy readers in the days to come. And I do hope that all of you will be among the happy readers in the days to come. I thank you.
I know many of you who have read Mr. Caldwell's books and articles have questions for him. We'll have a question and answer period that will start in about 10 minutes next door in the men's lounge. So please feel free to move in that direction.
We didn't keep anybody too long, did we?
Oh, no problem there. You want some water?
Are we going to have coffee over there?
Yeah.
No, we can get some coffee.
Okay, fine. Those of you who have questions, just put your hands up, and I'll try to field them, and we can stay for hopefully as long as you have questions. Speak loud and clear so everyone can hear them, and then we don't have to repeat. Good. Thank you.
I always wondered where the characters in a novel come from. Were the characters in your books people you met, composites of people you knew, or just pure fabrication?
Well, you know, it would be against the rules to say that a fictional character were a real character, because fiction itself means something that does not exist or something that's been created or invented. So, strictly speaking, in my case, everybody is fictitious. He's never existed, but I try to make him exist, as though he had lived or were living.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you, if you had to write the same stories today with the hope of having them made into movies, and I'm sure you were well satisfied with the film versions of your books, I imagine, would you find that you'd have the same response from the public, or would you find it more difficult? You were speaking of the censorship aspect and response and the receptivity of the public. Would people be responding in the same way that they did years ago?
If the books were done right
If
now.
the thing were to be done over again, any of your stories, Gaza or
You mean for film or
for a film? Yes.
for film? Well, of course, you know, there's been a revolution in filmmaking in the past 5 to 10 years. So even if they were made over, they wouldn't be made the same way they are now, I'm sure, because of the expanding world of filmmaking, we call it. So it would be much different. Not that I would have anything to do with it, because I never had anything to do with filming. But I'm just content to write the story anyway. So I don't know what the directors and so forth would want to do these days with a story of mine.
Well, would audiences be shocked and respond to it in the same way as what I read in the past?
I don't know. There would be, I suppose there would be, because it would be made differently. Because I don't suppose anything shocking right now in this contemporary atmosphere about those particular films.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that these books are better written today because of the four-letter word?
No. You see, we become obsessed by a four-letter word because it's so new and sort of startling. But that does not mean that the material itself or the result itself is any better for that any more than any other ingredient or symbol or whatever you want to say you find in a book is. No, I don't think so. It's just a side effect of freedom. We'll say freedom of the press, but it's not that important. Some people who use them, of course, just to be able to shock for the purpose of sensationalism, but that's aside from the point. That's everybody's always going to try to shock somebody anyway. So I don't consider that of much importance.
Yes.
Do you think a writer should try to train himself for a certain kind of writing or style, with a certain genre of poetry, or just write whatever comes to what is small or short? What's the
Well, now, I don't know whether I understand it correctly.
Do you think that writers have sort of, you were talking about natural talent is what you come against the creative writing process.
Yeah.
How do you think a writer should develop his own capabilities? Should he undertake to write certain kinds of novels?
Well, there are certain kinds of writing, such as fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and essays, and so forth. It all depends upon the interest of the writer himself. I suppose every writer tries out all the forms that he can work at, just see what he can do. Because I suppose most people write poetry at some time or other in their life. But usually, when you get up to a certain age, you realize that you might be better off doing something else than writing poetry, so you probably switch. But that's nothing against poetry. So a person should follow his bent, whatever his talent is. So it might be for essays, and not fiction or something.
Rose?
What?
I got your back.
Me? No, no, no. I don't write about California because I live here.
Yes, sir.
During the first early part of your writing, you had left your family in Maine and had a farm up there during the period of and you would leave them there while you went to New York or maybe some other area to do your writing. And I wondered, during that period of time, did you try to go to write in an area where you would live in an area where you would particularly hit any type of character?
Well, not on purpose, no, not purposely. It just happened that for a reason of moving around so much in different regions of the country was to get a perspective on something at some other place I'd previously been, and get away from it so I could look through it from the opposite end of the telescope, so to speak.
Do you still have your place in Maine?
Did I what?
Do you still have your place in Maine?
Well, I actually, sir, I never owned a place in Maine.
Well, you did live
I lived in Maine for about maybe 7 or 8 years, but I never had the possibility of owning anything. I was sort of a caretaker on a farm, with caretaker without pay, so I had to raise potatoes and cut wood while I was there, so I didn't accomplish anything economically speaking out of that situation, except to be able to write something.
You were able to maintain your family during the period while you were doing
That's right, that's right, that's right. You have to find some means, so that was the means I happened to find, which is very fortunate, I suppose.
Yes.
So do you feel the conditions you wrote about in Gaza Lake here in well, particularly Gaza Lake on Georgia, do you find that these conditions still exist in essence at least in the South?
Well, you have to put it this way, you see. Everything is relative. Everything in life is relative, so to speak, and so this is relative too. So when you ask that kind of a question, I would have to say yes and no, for this reason, because the economic changes that have taken place in the South have eradicated a lot of things that might have been true during the Depression era. For example, industrialization, not only in the factories but also in the farming industrialization it's taken place. Well, that has raised the standard of living among certain people, but not among all people, because a lot of people have been displaced by the machinery on a Delta cotton farm, for example. So what happened to them? They are probably in a worse position right now than people were 25 or 30 years ago, because they go to a town, crowd into a small village or something, and can't get jobs. So that exists. And then the other portion of people who are in that same condition are the people who have been pushed back and back into the Appalachian region, which is probably the most notorious poverty trap in the whole country now. Even though the poverty programs supposedly are working, it just does not touch everybody. They're too far removed from it.
Wouldn't that be good material for another book for you?
Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought of that just for the reason that I'm never looking for material, because there's so much things to write about. I have to spend most of my time trying to eliminate something to write about. Too many ideas in existence. You just have to do a process of elimination sometimes.
Yes, sir.
When you write, do you generally start with characters that you're interested in, or you think you could convey and present, or do you start with events and a plot and then fit characters to what you to a certain scene or story?
Well, there are a lot of ways to answer that because every writer is different. And what I would say would not apply to somebody else because everyone has to find his own method. And if you say I select characters first, well, that would not necessarily be applicable to you. You might want to select the setting for it first or something, or an idea for it. But for my part, I have to have an idea before I can write the first sentence. And then, if you have an idea, some people might call it a theme or something, but anyway, I call it an idea. Well, you have to have that before you can write the first sentence. Then your people come into it, and then you have a background or an environment for it. So your people live in that environment, so they enter into the idea.
Yes, sir.
Robert Frost said once about poets that if a poet hadn't found his voice by the time he was 25, chances were he never would. Do you think there's a cutoff date like that applies to all serious writing?
That you have to begin early?
If you haven't found the way to do it
Early?
Probably can't.
Well, of course, a lot of people who are much older than that have come along and have written many well-known books. But the probability is that they have been trying for many years prior to that before they accomplished this at the age of 30, 45, or 50, whatever it is. But I couldn't, I do know that up until the early 20s, why, it might be your most favorable time of life, because that's when you're in a learning period and you're willing to learn. Whereas when you get a little bit older, you become a little bit set in your ways and you reject learning pretty much. But that period, I'd say from 18 to 25 is probably the best period of all, either to accomplish or to learn to be able to accomplish later.
Yes, sir.
Did you participate in any way in the dramatization of the Tragedy War?
No, I've never indulged in that medium at all. So I'm just content to try to write stories and let other people have those headaches.
Are you satisfied with the production, Mr. Caldwell?
Of which one?
No, Dracula?
Well, yes, in a way. It was quite authentic. I haven't seen it lately, so I don't know whether the ending has been changed or not, but at one time I saw one version of it in which I didn't especially like, and that was when at the conclusion all the characters were seen walking down the road singing folk songs on the way to the poorhouse.
I think I saw that version.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any feelings about what critics ought to do, or would you just rather not have critics?
Critics?
Yes, critics.
Well,
Not just people who say something is good or bad, but who attempt to, say, explain or interpret.
well, you see, critics are not among my best friends. So I can speak about them, I suppose. I won't offend anybody. See, there are a lot of different kinds of critics. I would call an essayist type of critic is one of the good guys, because he sets out to explain something or to draw something out of a piece of work, not to try to tear it down or to depreciate it so much, because otherwise, if he's going to depreciate it, what would be the use of his wasting his time? So he wants to, an essayist type of critic, wants to bring out something that he has found there, and to whether it's symbolism or whatever it is he found, he wants to do that in a stylistic kind of way. And a good critic like that will develop a style that's very readable and will be interest to readers. Whereas the other critic who's continually deploring this kind of writer or this kind of work, who says, so this is no good, it's not true to life, and so forth. Well, I don't consider those critics worthy of the name. I'd much rather read a reviewer than a critic, because a reviewer is writing to tell the reader what the book is about and how successful it is in expressing what it's about. Whereas a critic, to me, he has an egotistical slant himself that he becomes more important than the work he's describing.
So you don't find the essays then, for example, you don't find that particular procedure of interpreting a book and
Not
explaining
an essayist, no. What I call the essayist. But what I'm talking about is a newspaper and a magazine type of critic who wants to be a little bit sensational, I think, rather than the essayist. Because there been a lot of good essayists in the English language all the way for the past 200 or 300 years, and so to me that's a very highly reputable occupation in life.
Yes, sir.
Do you have an opinion on John Steinbeck's Letters in Vietnam?
Have I seen it?
Yeah, do you have any comments?
Any comments? Well, I read some of his columns, probably not all of them. See what he's doing. I don't know whether he's trying to prove anything or not. He may be, and he may prove it, but so far, to me, it's around the fringes of the war rather than the war itself. Not because he injects too much of his own personality into it, because that's his privilege, but the fact that war is a very horrible thing. And I think he praises the war a little bit too much, the conditions of the war, the surrounding atmosphere of it, and that's just my personal feeling. That's the only comment I would make, I think.
Yes.
I can't hear this.
Yeah. Could you speak up or stand up or something?
Have you ever felt that you belong to a certain group of writers, or have you ever felt affinity with certain writers over the years that you might be?
I can't hear that.
Do you consider or group yourself within a certain group? Do you have any identities or affinities with particular people? Do you label yourself, I guess?
No. The answer is no. And the reason for that is that I've never been situated so that I was in the company of working writers. I've been around a lot of writers who are not working, but who are just talking about writing, which to me is a very discouraging atmosphere to be in. So I much prefer to be off by myself, not associated with writers at all if I can help it. I'll meet them socially and shake hands with them and so forth, but I don't want to become involved in a group or clique or organization of writers. There's nothing against it because it's fine for other people.
Roger?
Who would you, if you had to classify or categorize the 2 or 3 greatest American authors, who would you put at the very top of the list?
Is it 2 or 3?
2 or 3, greatest American writers, and why?
Well, you probably had a course in American literature, and you probably got some other names. And I hope those professors are not here. Well, you see, to me, Mark Twain was the first American, I wouldn't say realist or romanticist or anything, but the first American fiction writer of any consequence. And after Twain, I'd come a little bit further down in the calendar, and I would nominate Sherwood Anderson as one of the foremost American writers. Then I suppose if you have to name 3, I would say Hemingway would probably fit into that category.
Yes, sir.
Well,
Yeah.
on that particular list you just gave, I didn't hear you mention Melville. And it seems to me that Melville is certainly the equal of Twain.
Well, let's have an argument. Well, you see, I'm not acquainted as much with Melville then as you are. But Twain appealed to me because he wrote about the kind of life that I think I can appreciate, whereas I do not know too much about the Melville material, so to speak, and I don't recognize as readily as I do Mark Twain, because I lived a number of years up and down the Mississippi River, for example, in mid-America, as we call it, and to me, Twain's rambling around up and down that part of the country touched the life and incorporated that life into his writing better than anyone else that I can think of.
Yeah. Sir.
Well, you said hit on something there that I think is quite important. That in your writing, you have experienced the characters who've experienced a great deal of the things that you have written about, haven't you?
Well, you mean have I experienced what I write about?
You haven't made an actual piece history of them. In fictionalizing them, you have experienced many of the things that you've written about.
Well, you see, it works this way. A person, unless he writes fantasy or science fiction, otherwise a person has to know what he's writing about. He has to have experienced or observed the things and the people he writes about. And if you don't experience that, if you haven't observed it, why, what are you going to do? You go in the library and take out some costume books, maybe, or history books, and try to sift that out and try to write something secondhand. So that, to me, a writer has to observe, but that doesn't mean that he has to do it himself. I mean, in other words, a murder takes place, but that doesn't mean that I have to go out and kill somebody. Huh?
In reading your writing, that tells me that you've had a very strong empathy for people that you've been writing about.
Well, it's just because that's the kind of life I lived, and I'm one of the people, so to speak. I used to be a plowboy and so forth, and so I think I came out of that environment. So that's all I know.
Isn't that part of the reason for your being able to write as successfully as you have about it?
Well, I don't know. I have to leave that up to you as a reader to say whether I'm successful or not in that respect.
Yes, sir.
Yes, and that brings me again to the question I think you brought up before about the instance of some of the characters. I forget the name of the fellow with the two daughters. Is that in Tobacco Road? I'm trying to remember the part, how realistic these people were, and you see this dramatized from time to time. I wondered if you knew these people or if they were also
Well,
figments of the
I don't know the particular
characters.
reference you have there to what book it was, but I can say that no, I never saw these people before in my life. But after you write something like this, you can go out and find counterparts in life.
Well, I mean, are there people like that you actually?
I found them after I've written it, afterwards, not before.
The old man with the two daughters and so forth.
Well, there are a lot of daughters in my books. I don't know whether 2, 3, or 4 daughters, but anyway, but that's the idea I'm talking about. That no, when you're sitting down to write something, you're not transcribing something that exists. That would be nonfiction, or it'd be reporting or something else. You have to make these people. But you have to have some knowledge of people themselves or their environment for this to come out of it.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Caldwell, you said that one earlier when you were speaking that the more widely read a person was, the more apt he was to become, or he would become more tolerant. Do you think, did you say something about this? In other words, do you become more familiar with different kinds of people or characters in fiction?
Well, you see, what I probably had in mind there was this, that intolerance is essentially ignorance. When you're intolerant of a social condition or moral condition, that means that you're not acquainted with it, that you've never understood it, you never experienced it, or you never read about it. But when you read the various phases of life in novels or in books of any kind, when you read all this, then you become to understand the attitudes and the ideals of other people. Whereas if that's missing in your life, then you have no comparison to make. So you accept all these things because they're part of the population, so to speak. So you become tolerant of it. You understand it better. You can understand why a person wants to have his civil rights, for example. Why he insists upon it, or why he should have his civil rights, so forth.
Yes, sir.
Do you find that the plot conforms at the end of your work pretty much to what you had intended it to, or as you write it, it develops quite a bit?
Well, I can only speak about myself, of course, and how I do things, and sometimes I don't even know how I do them till they come out, because I don't think you can have any set rule about doing these things. The idea dictates what's going to happen and what the result is going to be. But you know your material to start with. You know what the content is going to be more or less, but you don't always know how it's going to work out, because as you go along, you have other ideas about things that might change your whole attitude towards the story, and it might come out completely different in the end.
Yes, sir.
You made a comment about shock writers in the present, using a four-letter word. Would you consider yourself a shock writer of the 30s, perhaps?
No, sir.
Or did you just write it as you saw it?
It had to be as it was. In other words, it could not be falsified by trying to cover up something or to hide something or to avoid something or evade something. But if you're going to tell a story the way it is, the way it should be, the way it comes to you, you have to be honest about it. And of course, the fact that they are sensationalists and so people who try to shock the reader into wanting to read a book, to talk about it, to pass it around, and so forth, just means that these people are avoiding good taste, because good taste in writing is the same as good taste in table manners, dress, conduct, behavior on the street, and so forth. It's good taste, you know. So the same thing applies in books and writing. It's a matter of good taste. What taste is, of course, depends on who you are and what your background is, what your education is, and so forth. That all depends. But there's a sort of a level of good taste in life, sort of a level. And if you go too far one way or something, then you lose that good taste and become bad taste.
In your speech, you stressed a lot, of course, personal and in general experience as it comes out in an author's themes and in his writing. 20 years from now, when the people who are my age now are most prolific, in their 30s and 40s and in their 50s, because of the kind of large educational society that we will be brought up, how do you think that will affect the themes of the books we're going to be writing? The themes of the books that came out of people who grew up in the hard times of the 30s and the war have some way to classify many of them. They fall into certain patterns.
Yeah.
What kinds of themes or patterns would you see coming out of the society that grew up, quote, in affluence?
Well, right now, I think if you're going to try to forecast something for the future, I think you just have to take contemporary life as it is and say that's going to be the basis of what you're going to be writing about, because you'll be going back 20 years and you're going back to say what was happening in 1967. You'll be writing about, if it's about college life, it might be about protests of some kind, or the revolt against certain ideas and so forth. So it is the age of protest. We see that every day. Somebody protesting against something, civil rights or Vietnamese war and so forth and so forth. So that's the basis of ferment that's going on right now, is this age of protest. And of course the people who engaged in it are the people of your age. So that's going to be a great influence in the future. And of course this revolution of ideas, I hope, is going to continue, because we don't want to get stuck with this, what we got right now. We want something more, something better, for example, to come out of this. So maybe that's what you'll be writing about. how 20 years from now life is better than it was in 1967 because the agitation of among students.
Will there be not only a protest against the content of what's written, but what about the style and the forms of what are written? Do you see our college-bred generation is coming up with something new besides a novel, besides an essay? Is there going to be a new written form?
Well, of course, that's all visionary. I couldn't forecast or project that at all, other than the fact that the base is being made for something. Now, what this is going to be, I don't know, but the novel changes in form. You compare a contemporary novel with a British novel of 100 years ago, and you can see the difference immediately side by side. The style of writing, all the lengthy verbiage that comes out of the old English novel and so forth compared to the quick type of writing now. So there's a difference. Now, what it's going to be in the future, I don't know. But the novel changes, and so it's going to change again. It won't be static. It never is static. It has to be something new because the novel itself, novel means something new. So it can't be the same. It never will.
Yes, sir.
Have you found that success being in the public eye has interfered more than you might wish with your contact with life,
Well, you see, I try to avoid it, that kind of contact as much as I can, even though I'm pleased to be here right now today. But I do this for my educational purposes. That's the reason I do this for 5 or 6 weeks of the year. I do it for my continuing education process, so to speak. But I hope that I haven't been influenced by this activity of that I get into, the result of it, whatever you want to call it, because I do try to avoid it, and I get home criticism for not being more social-minded than I am.
I think I meant partly, of course, before you were famous as a writer, you perhaps go and come in a different way than you now can.
Well, that's very true, because in the old days I used to travel by bus wherever I went. Now I go by airplane. So you see, there's a difference.
Little insulation.
Yeah. You just can't help it. I don't think I could get my wife to take a bus trip from here to New York now. I've done it myself in the old days, but I don't think I'd want to do it right now, unless I had a good purpose for it.
Okay.
Well, of course, if you stay away from New York, why, you avoid a lot of that kind of contact with life, too, you know. Get away from New York.
We'll make these two the last questions. Yes, sir.
When I asked you about Melville, you said you had no contact with this type of life, so you couldn't judge it. Is this your, I'm not necessarily criticizing, but is this your criteria for judging the merits of a given writer, that you have to experience what he's experienced?
Well, I think I have to be able to realize the authenticity of what they're doing. In other words, I think I have to have a little bit of knowledge of what they're writing about in order to appreciate it.
How then, if I can ask you, how, on that basis, how would we be able to judge the value of the Greek playwrights of 3,000 years ago?
Of who?
Sophocles and.
Oh, well, you see, some of the age-old truths they say never die out.
How about the Victorians?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm getting a little bit over my depths here because you are evidently an authority on Melville. So I better not get in an argument with you on that.
Yes, this will be the last question.
I haven't read your more recent writings. Has this, have your public appearances and public tours, such as this one coming here, and the fact that you are living more in cities these days, at least part of the year, than you have before, has this affected your writing? In this sense, have you written urban type stories lately, on account of your living more in cities?
Well, of course, It's unavoidable, completely unavoidable. You can't avoid certain things in life, and if you're living in an urban society, you have to live it that way. What that effect is, I don't know. It will show, I suppose, in what I do. I'm not too much conscious of it, even though I do know there are more people around now than there were before, because people are leaving the country and going to urban life. But there's just as much material in that as there would be back in the country, so to speak, in the old days when people were living on the farms more than they do now. So what the effect is going to be, I don't know, but I have to write about the people I know who are now living in an urban society. So I'm probably writing more about that than I would about the previous type.
Well, on behalf of myself and those students of UCLA that have come to this question and answer period especially, thank you very much.